Everyone, if everybody could find a seat, now is the time. We have a few seats available. So good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Rebelo. I'm the Senior Director of Communications here at the Buck Institute. It is my extreme pleasure on what may be a difficult day for many of us to welcome you here to our 8th event of our Live Longer, Better seminar series. Today, we learn about the mechanisms of brain aging, and you're going to get some tips on how to take care of your noggin. So, a couple quick housekeeping notes. If you haven't already done it, please put your phones on mute. And I'd like to keep the fire marshal happy, in which case I am pointing out the emergency exits at the back of the room. So, how many of you are new to the Buck? It's always a thrill to see new people. Rather than me expounding on the wonders of our science, I'm going to show you a video that features the folks who are really doing the work. So, Jordan, if you could run that, that would be great.
The Buck Institute is interested in understanding aging, not only to make us live longer, but to actually alleviate and suppress the development of diseases.
Chronic disease is the great health challenge of our time. Aging is the main driver of chronic disease. To eliminate chronic disease, we must harness the biology of aging so we can live healthy longer. The Buck Institute is the world's first research organization dedicated solely to the biology of aging. We work with the building blocks of biology to understand how we age.
The Buck is concentrating on really trying to go to the root of the problem, so understanding that we can sort of intervene really early.
The Buck Institute is probably the best place in the world to be working on aging because there's so many different aspects of aging that are being studied. It's key because no one lab can do it all.
Our scientific explorers are brilliant, curious, and committed.
The idea that you could actually develop drugs that slow down the aging process was really something that 20 or 30 years ago people thought this cannot be done. Not only can it be done, but we will do it.
The pieces are in place. And we are in a unique position to put them together. Our world is defined by paradigm shifts, created by scientific discoveries. The biology of aging is the next frontier.
We're working toward a world where healthcare is better. It's a world where if we can eradicate the aging component to disease, we're all going to live healthier and longer.
It's just an incredible vision that really will, surpass anything else that we've ever seen before.
We are inviting you to a future of aging without illness. It's happening today, and it's happening here. Join us.
I agree. So, before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank our sponsors. They're listed in your program. I also want to make sure you all have note cards. That's how you're going to submit questions today. When you have a question, raise a hand and one of our volunteers will pick up that card. If you need another card, we'll get one to you as well. So, I want to give a special welcome. We have a lot of folks on Zoom today. You too can ask questions. Just put them in the Q&A section on Zoom, and I'll have somebody run them up to me here. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Ashley Webb. So Ashley has a lab here at the Buck. They study the molecular mechanisms of brain aging and neurodegeneration. Ashley hails from Ann Arbor, Michigan. You can read about her educational background and her many awards in the program. In short, her graduate work focused on stem cells and regeneration. After that, she parlayed that expertise into a prestigious postdoc appointment at Stanford University, where she got involved in studies involving the brain. She was at Brown University in Rhode Island before joining the Buck last year. So, one final note. Ashley is a doctor, but she has a PhD, not an MD. So, nothing discussed today should be taken as medical advice. Be sure to talk to your doctors before you make any lifestyle changes. And that said, we welcome your questions. Please make sure they are of general interest. Ashley, come on up. Let's get started. Okay, we're going to get right into it. Brain anatomy and aging. So we're talking about normal aging. What happens? And these images, the top three are from younger people and the bottom are from older people. So what happens?
Right. And so before I get right into the brain, I do want to thank you and thank everyone for being here. And I do realize it's a challenging day for many, and that's why I'm particularly happy to be here with our community and to talk about something that I feel is very important and impactful. So let's get started. So as Chris mentioned, so we've got 6 brains here. The top 3, these are actually female brains, by the way. This is not imaging that was done by me, but I think this is a great example of what happens to the brain during aging. And so in the top 3, these are younger individuals. The bottom 3, these are older women, on average 92.7 years old. And I think right away, you don't have to be a physician to recognize some of the differences, right? One of the most striking differences that occurs with age is this increased black space. And that's actually space that's filled with fluid. It's cerebrospinal fluid, which is important for brain health and function. And those spaces are actually getting larger in the brain with age. And the reason for that is that there's actually a decrease in the matter of the brain, the white matter of the brain and the gray matter of the brain. In a way that the white matter, I think, is a little bit more obvious on these images. And if you look at the images on the left, the arrows are actually pointing to some tracts in the brain. This is referred to as the corpus callosum, different parts of it. It's white matter, and white matter is regions, this is axon tracts, right, that are myelinated. And so this tends to decrease with age, and that impacts processing speed, for example. There's also a decrease in what we call gray matter, which is the more gray areas, and that is more the areas that have like neurons and dendrites and things that are important for more plasticity in the brain. And so those are actually reduced as well, unfortunately. So leading to these increased ventricle spaces, these increased black spaces. And then the last thing that I'll point out about these images, although not directly related to brain health, but I think is pretty apparent here. If you look at the rings around the brains, that's actually that's showing the bone density. And in these women, you can see that the older women actually have an increased brightness surrounding their brain, which is reflective of the loss of bone density that occurs with age, and that is the reason for increased fractures, for example. So lots going on, and so this is just sort of at the more anatomical level here.
So we're going to get to symptoms, but before that, I want to share my own personal story, and I just am curious how many of you can relate to this. So when I have a busy day and I need to write, I work at home usually, I'm sitting in my little home office, I'm typing away, I get up with purpose, and I walk to the kitchen, and then I get to the kitchen and I go, what am I here for?
Yep.
Right? So what the heck is that about? And is that something to be worried about?
So first of all, this is very common, right? It's so common. In fact, it's so common that it actually has a term. It's called the doorway effect. And it's true. And it turns out it doesn't just happen in older individuals. This actually happens to everyone, even younger individuals. And so it happens due to the way that our brain works in terms of how we organize our goals, right? And so we have a hierarchy that's in our brain, but then if we move into a new environment, say to go find our glasses or our keys or whatever, as soon as we enter that environment, that hierarchy is disrupted. And as we get older, it's harder for our short-term memory to sort of maintain the intention that you had to begin with. And so I want to talk about some positive things. So that's unfortunate, right? And it's mostly just annoying, I think, in most cases. But the positive here is that I want to point out is that there's actually a reason for that from an evolutionary perspective. And the importance of being able to switch tasks has actually been really key across evolution, right? So if you think more of an animal that is in one environment and then for some reason its environment changes suddenly due to a predator or a new opportunity, that animal needs to be able to switch tasks and focus on that new thing. And so it isn't always a good thing to actually retain what you were doing before. And so, although, like I said, it's annoying, it's unfortunate, it gets worse with age, give yourself a little break and remember that actually in some cases it's a good thing to be able to switch tasks when you're in that new environment and let the past go.
So, but there's nothing worrisome about that per se.
No, I mean, like I said, I think so. Like I said, it happens in younger individuals. It happens in older individuals. It does get a little bit worse with age. Individuals with dementia are going to have a harder time.
Got it.
Right, because there's a lot. There can be confusion, and so that's when you get into sort of concerning territory. But happens to me all the time, and the more tired I am, the more distracted I am, the more likely it is to happen. And then the last thing I'll say about this doorway effect is, and many people mention this, how to sort of solve this problem. Go back to the first environment, right? So if you go back to the first environment that you were in, then you'll suddenly remember, oh yeah, this is what I was doing. And then you can, go back to the second room with a little more intention and a little more focus and go get your glasses or whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So what other behavioral kind of symptoms are common with aging?
Yeah, so there are many things that occur with age. The number one thing is the decline in learning and memory functions. So that's common. It involves a number of different brain regions. So our speed of processing, our ability to retain things in our memory as we're doing tasks is challenging. So that's working memory is the term for that. So for example, if you are if you have in mind your dinners for the week and you're trying to make a grocery list at the same time and you're kind of trying to keep all of those things in mind at the same time, that can get more difficult with age. But we can have strategies to handle that better. Spatial memory becomes more challenging, which is a form of episodic memory. So that's the situation where the example that I love is, even for me, I drive into work in the morning, work all day in my office, go back out, where's my car, right? Or the grocery store or the mall, wherever you go. And that is something that gets harder with age, right? It gets harder and harder to go back out. And now there are even apps that people use, right? You can track your car and remember where it is. So those are a couple of examples. And again, I want to end it on a positive note and give you an example of something that does improve with age. And that's actually some of our verbal abilities, so our vocabulary, for example. So some good news here. So our vocabulary actually increases at least until we're about 65, and then it tends to stay pretty constant after that. And sometimes there's a little bit of a decrease, but so it's not everything. In fact, there is some good news here.
And also older adults, since they have this lifetime of experience, I've read that they have better
Yes.
judgment or a better ability to sort of read a room?
Wisdom. I call that wisdom, and it's absolutely true. It's harder to measure, it's harder to quantify, it's harder to define, but that's a form of wisdom, and that increases with age. And that's because our semantic memory, so things that accumulate with age, and this also relates to the vocabulary situation, those things do improve with age. So, there is something to the wise older individual. It's absolutely true, and I think there are some cultures that value that more than others. But it's the truth, yeah.
Great. Okay. So before we get into tips for us, I want to talk about your science. A lot of your science involves an area of the brain called the hippocampus. What the heck is the hippocampus?
What is this thing? Right. So for starters, the schematic diagram that's on the left, that's actually a section through a mouse brain, just to be absolutely clear. That's not a human brain on the left. And it's just a cartoon that I think I actually drew that many years ago. And so that's really just a slice, this way through a mouse brain. So if you cut here, you open it up, you see this structure called the hippocampus, which is in purple. And there's a substructure in the hippocampus known as the dentate gyrus. And I'll come back to that dentate gyrus structure in a minute. And so the hippocampus is important. It's been pretty widely studied. It's one of the more commonly studied areas of the brain in the context of aging. And that's because this is a key part of the brain that's important for our learning and memory functions. Unfortunately, it's also a part of the brain that degenerates early on in Alzheimer's disease. And it's one of the most affected areas in the disease, which is why cognitive impairments are an early sign of Alzheimer's. And on the right, in these images, they're not images that I took, but this is another example of a healthy brain on the left with a section through it on the bottom, as well as the whole brain on top. And then on the right, again, you don't need to be a doctor to recognize some of the changes that are going on here. And in the case of Alzheimer's disease, right away you can see the shrinkage of the brain. And that shrinkage is even more severe than what we see in normal non-pathological aging. And that's because in Alzheimer's disease, there's actual cellular death that's occurring. So we're actually losing neurons in Alzheimer's disease. It starts in the hippocampus and a surrounding area of the hippocampus. And then later on in the disease, it's more widespread in the brain. And so unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't have strategies to replace neurons once they're lost. And now just to orient you in the human brains on the right, if you can see there's a smaller red circle that's circling one little piece of the normal brain. That's actually the hippocampus.
So where is that
Yeah, so that would be inside here.
Okay.
Yeah, inside.
Kind of behind the ear.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
And bilaterally, so both sides.
All right.
Yeah.
So then we go on to your specific work. So new neurons form in the adult hippocampus. You're trying to grow new neurons. So I remember from biology class, I was taught that the neurons that you're born with are the only neurons you're ever going to get. But that's not true, right?
It turns out that is not true. And so that's great news. Now, this isn't happening everywhere. So this one of the interests that we have in our lab is this process of neurogenesis, which is new neuron formation, and it exists in just this one part of the brain in humans, as far as we know, and that's this dentate gyrus portion of the hippocampus. So on the left, we're sort of zooming in. This is a schematic that one of my graduate students drew, and we're sort of zooming into the hippocampus region. And remember I mentioned that dentate gyrus part of the hippocampus? That's this lighter blue portion that's labeled as DG. And so that's where these stem cells are. And we study them primarily in the mouse. It's also common to look at them in the rat. There's lots of neurogenesis in mice and rats, and that hasn't been controversial. It's well known that mice and rats make new neurons in this part of the brain throughout life. And so that's possible, again, because there are these neural stem cells, and they're the cells that are shown in green on the very bottom part of the diagram. And those neural stem cells, they can actually divide, and once they divide, they can actually go on to differentiate, which means they turn into a specific type of neuron. It's a mature neuron called a granule neuron that connects to other parts of the hippocampus, and it's the formation of these new neurons that actually supports learning and memory functions. It's not the only way that learning and memory is supported in the brain, but if you remove them, so if mice don't have them, they don't learn as well, they don't remember as well. So we know from a lot of work in the rodent that these are key cells in this part of the brain, in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus.
So has your work done good things for mice?
Yes. So that's what we are working on right now. So on the right, this is an actual image of what these cells look like in the mouse brain. This is an image taken by Kelsey Babcock, who's a graduate student of mine. She's actually a Brown graduate student who's still working with me. And so what she did here is she actually just took a slice through a mouse brain, and she labeled all of the cells in blue. And then the green cells, these are actually the neural stem cells. And so this is a special genetic trick that we use where we can actually visualize and express and visualize a green fluorescent protein just in these stem cells. And so now that we have this nice marker marking the stem cells, we can actually look at ways to improve neuron formation or improve the health of these cells, for example, by exercising the animals. That will improve the health of these cells.
So why is it difficult to study this stuff in humans?
Right. So going back to the controversy related to the human. So it has been very hard to detect neurogenesis in humans. There's currently really still no good method for doing this in humans while we're still alive. And in fact, there weren't even very good methods for finding these cells post-mortem, from brain donors, for many, many years. There were some ways of looking at them, but they weren't very good, and they weren't very trustworthy. So people were very skeptical. And then just in the last 5 to 10 years, there was a group in Spain that found a really great way to preserve these cells in post-mortem brains and actually use a specific type of protein known as an antibody to detect features of these cells, basically. So to detect proteins that are inside these cells. Not to get too technical, but to detect proteins that are inside these cells and then use those as sort of molecular visualizations of where these cells are in the brain. And what they found was that there actually are quite a number of these neural stem cells and these new neurons forming in the adult brain. And just like in rodents, they don't form new neurons as well with age. And just like in rodent models of Alzheimer's disease, they make even fewer neurons with age in Alzheimer's disease.
So what's your end goal when it comes to human health? Like what's the possibility that you're going after?
Yeah, so in this case, so specific to neurogenesis, so the moonshot would be, right? Let's talk the best case scenario. Potentially, we can harness these cells, figure out ways to boost them, and then replace neurons that have undergone neurodegeneration and then have died in the context of Alzheimer's disease. Now that's a moonshot. That's very hard, and that's very specific to one part of the brain, just one small region of the brain. And we're not going to solve, all of Alzheimer's with that one little part of the brain, but it could actually help to boost memory to some extent. But then the second key point here is more on a basic biology level. And it's more about understanding the biology of these cells, because these cells are the ones that are going to tell us how to make a new neuron in the adult brain, and they're the only cells that are going to tell us how a neuron can actually incorporate into the existing circuitry of the brain, because these cells have figured this out across evolution, and they're still doing this even in us, right? So if we can understand that biology, I believe, will be applicable to many different contexts, whether it's cell therapy contexts in other diseases like Parkinson's disease, for example, or other neurodegeneration contexts. I think we have a lot to learn from these cells just at a basic biology level.
So your lab also does some work in the hypothalamus.
Yes.
Which one of my favorites here. So talk about your work in the hypothalamus, and then what's your work there?
Yeah. So we're moving into a different part of the brain, and this is actually work that is a little bit more, it's newer to my lab. It's a newer area, And just to give you a little bit of history here, we got into this because I really felt like this was a very understudied region of the brain in the context of aging. Lots of people are looking at the hippocampus, and that is really important, and there's a reason for that. It's the Center for Learning and Memory. The hypothalamus is a very different part of the brain. It's evolutionarily ancient, and it has many functions. It has many diverse functions, and you're going to be surprised that it's not well studied in aging when I tell you the functions. So the functions are things like regulating sleep, regulating our metabolism, our stress levels, reproduction. So all of these things that we know are so critical for healthy aging, this is the central area of the brain that's top-down controlling these functions. And yet there weren't very many labs studying it. There were a few. And even more interesting to that, if we think about lifespan itself, there were actually a small number of studies that showed if you intervened or altered the function of very specific types of neurons in the hypothalamus, you could actually extend lifespan in mice. And so for me, putting all of that together, I thought, why is nobody looking at this at more the molecular level? And I'm a molecular biologist, so I thought, let's get in there. Okay, so where are we in the brain now? So now we're more over the roof of the mouth and more central in the brain. And so on the left side, human brain here, you can see where the hypothalamus there was pointing right to the center over the roof of the mouth. And interestingly, the hypothalamus, it sits above the pituitary gland as well. And so that's another reason why this part of the brain is so central for healthy aging. It has top-down control of our endocrine functions as well. And then on the right, I'm just highlighting one specific portion of the hypothalamus, which is known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And neuroscientists over the years have come up with these really complicated names for things, and it's mostly anatomical, but we'll call it the SCN. And so the SCN is just one subregion of the hypothalamus, and it's a fascinating region to highlight because this is the part of the brain that actually receives light directly from the retinas. And so this is the part of the brain that's important for our circadian rhythms and for our sleep patterns. And there are a number of different things that I could talk about, a lot of things related to changes in hypothalamic function with age, specifically with the suprachiasmatic nucleus. But we do know in terms of daily life is if you get sunlight, particularly in the morning, that can help to entrain the hypothalamus and keep you on a regular circadian rhythm, which is good for sleep patterns, which in turn is good for healthy aging.
Great. I understand that in your lab, you're working on female mice, right? When it comes to the hypothalamus. So why and how important is gender overall in the whole question of brain aging?
Yeah. So this is a great question, and this is really an emerging area in the field. And we've known sort of anecdotally for some time that men's brains and women's brains are potentially different, and not better or worse, but just different. And we've also known that when we look at certain like neurodegenerative diseases, like Alzheimer's disease, that Alzheimer's disease is actually more prevalent in females than it is in males. There's been lots of speculation and lots of theories over the years, and we don't know exactly why that is the reality, but it is very clear that there are more women living with Alzheimer's disease than men. So there are clear differences in the brains of men and women that we need to get our heads around. And so that was actually one of the motivations for my lab to start working on female mice. Historically, this may come as a surprise, but actually historically, pretty much everyone worked on male mice. If you go back 10, 15 years, almost all the studies were on male mice. There were a number of reasons for that, and some of them weren't actually bad reasons. So for example, some of the behavioral paradigms and tasks that people had developed just work differently in males and females, and they had been developed in males. And so it was just sort of easier to work with what you know, right? I mean, it's so hard to control studies in science that, okay, it works in males, it's a little different in females, so let's just do it in males. And that's fine, but we're at a point now where we need to study both. And so I sort of decided, along with my female graduate students, when we started getting into the hypothalamus, that we were going to prioritize the female hypothalamus. And in part because of this known sex difference in Alzheimer's disease. So we shifted into females.
Great. So you talked about circadian rhythms. Here's some scary stuff about sleep deprivation. I got to tell you, I'm getting questions about sleep, so we will.
We can talk about sleep.
Yes, we'll talk about sleep.
Yeah. So this is. I just wanted to highlight just one study. It's actually 10 years ago now, or so, 11 years ago, that this was published, and so we've known this for some time, right? That there's this association between sleep disruption and neurodegeneration and impaired memory functions as we age. And so these are just a couple examples from one particular study looking at the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease on the left and just the overall rate of cognitive decline on the right. And so here they've just taken people and they've separated them into two groups. This is based on wearables. And what they found was that individuals with higher sleep fragmentation, so more night awakenings, actually have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And on the right, they showed that people with lower sleep fragmentation, so if you sleep a little more smoothly through the night, the rate of cognitive decline in these individuals is actually a little bit slower. And so this is just an association. It's not causative. The best causative evidence in terms of sleep fragmentation and sleep disruptions actually potentially causing or worsening Alzheimer's disease, again, comes from rodents and animal studies where we can actually disrupt the sleep and then show that the animals with the disrupted sleep actually have the worse performance and they have worse Alzheimer's pathologies in the Alzheimer's models compared to animals that are sleeping well. So we're sort of going, it goes both directions, right? So Alzheimer's disease does disrupt your sleep, but it's becoming pretty clear that better sleep will actually lower your risk for Alzheimer's as well.
So I got a question. How does somebody get a full night's sleep when you wake up? I mean, you mentioned getting light in the morning. Are there any other tips? And if you don't, that's fine. I know you're not a sleep scientist, but
Right.
what can you say about sleep?
Yeah, so there's more and more coming out, more and more data coming out in terms of what we can do. And a lot of these data are now coming out because the wearables are getting better, so sleep tracking is getting better. So we're getting a handle on this to some extent. So things that can be done are things like going to sleep at the same time every night, sleeping in a very dark room, potentially even sleeping with an eye mask. Even very small amounts of light will actually be detected in the hypothalamus. So it doesn't take much. So if you get up and you have to use the restroom or get up for whatever reason, the lower you can keep the lights, the better. Temperature is also important. I didn't mention temperature when talking about the hypothalamus. Body temperature is also controlled by the hypothalamus, it turns out, and it decreases over the course of the night. So sleeping in a cooler room tends to help. Not eating too close to bedtime. Keeping your alcohol intake, I'm sorry for this one, not too many glasses of wine. So, alcohol does impair sleep. And unfortunately, I know that a lot of times we feel like alcohol helps sleep because it can help us enter sleep, but the quality of sleep is not as high. Alcohol-induced sleep, or sleeping when you've had alcohol on board, it's more of a state that is induced by like a sedative, as opposed to entering normal, natural sleep. And so it can disrupt your REM cycles and your non-REM sleep. So be careful with that one, unfortunately.
Got it. Okay, so how to modify your risk factors to reduce the risk of dementia. So even though there are more people getting Alzheimer's, because those of us in the baby boomer generation, there's a huge cohort, but is it true that on a personal basis our risk for Alzheimer's is going down?
Well, that relates to these risk factors. So again, the good news is that as we learn more and more about these risk factors, we can get a little bit of control. There's more that we can do to reduce our risk. And so the answer is yes to that. And so I think that some of these things are easier to control than others, right? But no doubt we can work on our sleep, we can work on our diet, we can work on our physical activity, and those things will reduce our risk in a real way. Some things might be harder. Individuals who live in areas where pollution is high, that might be a little bit harder to control, unfortunately. But socialization is one that we do have a little bit more control over, on the other hand. So get out there, hang out with your friends, make new friends. That's a really good thing.
So I want to talk specifically about some of them, and I've gotten questions that relate. The first one is blood pressure.
Yeah.
And I know that there's been some research that shows that a lot of dementia might be kick-started by vascular problems in the brain. And then I also, so let's talk to that, and I'm going to find the other question that goes with it. Okay.
Yeah, so blood pressure, high blood pressure, hypertension is another sort of emerging area where we're starting to better understand the risk that is associated with developing dementia. And this has been picked up in a number of studies, in scans looking at changes in vasculature in the brain within individuals that have high blood pressure and hypertension. And it turns out that many individuals with Alzheimer's disease also have this comorbidity, or this situation where they have a vascular disease. So it's actually very common these days. What we're seeing is it's very common to actually have the two. So again, modifiable risk factor. If you can reduce your blood pressure, get out of a hypertensive state, then that can actually lower your risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia.
Because they say what's good for the heart is good for the brain,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
So I got a question about leaky blood-brain barriers. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, so the blood-brain barrier, so this also relates to the vasculature of the brain. And when we're young, we have a very robust blood-brain barrier. And so really this is just a selective barrier between what's in our circulation and what gets into our brain. And so the brain is very, very choosy, right? And because it's just protecting itself. And so there are some drugs, for example, that don't cross the blood-brain barrier. So when companies are developing drugs, that's actually a major consideration. Does it get across? Does it get into the brain? But unfortunately, what happens with age is this blood-brain barrier is compromised. It's very compromised in a situation like a stroke, right? But then in Alzheimer's disease and in individuals with these vascular changes that occur related to high blood pressure, there is a reduction in blood-brain barrier, and that can actually lead to increased neuroinflammation in the brain. Yeah.
So kind of a two-part question here. Somebody wants to know, what role does insulin resistance play? And that is part of our under diabetes there and diet. And then also, why do individuals on a ketogenic diet often experience increased clarity or reduction of brain fog? And I got other questions about brain fog.
Yeah.
What's brain fog? And then let's talk about sugar, diabetes, and the impact of that.
Yeah. So brain fog is, it's sort of a squishy term, I would say, but it's just a lack of clarity in our thought process, and it can occur for a number of reasons. Stress, lack of sleep, and it is more common with age. Chemotherapy-induced brain fog. Menopause is a common one where people describe entering a state of brain fog. And the good news, actually, it's in some cases, and in most cases, I think it's actually reversible, right? So when we think about the brain fog that women describe during menopause, most women actually come out of that. And same with chemotherapy, people can come out of that. So that's a good thing. And related to diabetes and insulin resistance. So insulin resistance, I think, as most people know, is that's one thing that happens in diabetes. And our brains, we really rely on insulin signaling. Our brains are very dependent on insulin signaling for maintenance of brain function. And so in individuals with diabetes, where there's insulin resistance, the insulin isn't functioning as well as it should in the brain, leading to brain fog. One interesting, I think, emerging area in the diabetes space is the fact that people who are taking Ozempic and Wegovy are actually showing potentially improved cognition, but decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, if you go back and look at the huge trial that Novo Nordisk did when they were first doing their big trial on Ozempic, they actually found in their post-hoc analysis, so basically looking at the data after everything was done, they actually found that there were few individuals who were taking the Ozempic who got Alzheimer's disease. And so now they actually have a standalone trial where they're just looking directly at Alzheimer's disease. So where they're actually controlling for everything they can and actually just looking at, okay, do individuals on Ozempic actually have less frequent Alzheimer's disease? And I think it's looking very promising. The mechanisms are not known, but very likely it is due to this issue of insulin resistance, changes in glucose levels, and our ability to better maintain our blood glucose.
So that would mean for those of us who don't need to lose weight, and we probably wouldn't get those drugs, cutting back on sugar is a good thing, right?
Cutting back on sugar is a good thing. Sorry, another thing people don't want to hear. But it's true. I mean, so our brain uses so much energy. Like, it really does. It's sitting there, but it really is an organ that uses lots and lots of energy, lots of glucose. And so if we can, the more we can keep our blood glucose levels under control with fewer spikes, the better off we are.
That's great. So I am getting questions about stress, and can't imagine why in a day like this. So how does stress impact the brain? And we live in a stressful world. Do you have any tips? Maybe you don't, about how to manage that.
Yeah. So there's lots to unpack here. That's a huge territory, and it's not even touching on physical stress, which is also associated with dementia, as we're seeing, unfortunately, in professional sports players, like football players. Okay, so physical stress we'll set aside. So emotional stress, really important and emerging area, and there's been a lot of work, particularly in women who have experienced even early traumatic stress, younger in adulthood. And even if you experience that stress younger in adulthood, that can still impact brain function later on. So chronic stress is not good. Chronic stress can increase inflammation in the brain. We can talk about the mechanisms of that if you like. And it can impair the white matter in the brain, so the myelination, which is important for the speed of processing in the brain, and that can result in these things like brain fog. And so, I don't know if I have in my back pocket the answer to stress, but one thing I will note, and this is a little bit anecdotal, but has been observed by the scientists who study centenarians. So individuals who live to be 100 plus, it has been pretty much anecdotally observed that they tend to be lower stress, lower anxiety individuals. It's a common personality trait that centenarians can sort of let things go, move on, roll with the punches. So it's, so I think it's a real thing, not just for brain health, but overall healthy aging in general.
Got a number of questions about exercise. So the benefits of exercise, physical activity is there. Some questions about if there's particular physical exercise, but maybe you want to talk about overall. What are we doing when we're out there moving?
Yeah. So it's likely a number of different mechanisms by which exercise improves brain health. I keep circling around this idea of inflammation, and so I'll just touch on it in a little bit more depth, maybe. So when I'm talking about brain inflammation, There are a couple different forms of that. One form is in the activation of cells called microglia. So it turns out that we do have immune cells in the brain. They're a little different from the ones that are circulating and the ones that are in the periphery. And microglia are all over the brain, and they're a good thing initially. They're great because they can do things like get rid of amyloid. If they need to, they can do things like prune synapses to finely tune the connectivity in the brain. But unfortunately, with aging, they can also become activated and inflamed. And so that's a situation where the microglia are no longer our friends. They are actually starting to do bad things. They can actually prune or reduce synapses that we need. They can also release things like cytokines that impair the function of the neurons in the brain. So again, causing things like brain fog and reducing our processing speed. And so when I mention this phenomenon of inflammation and things like stress increasing inflammation, I'm talking about this increased activity of the microglia to release things that are bad, basically, and start, not being our friends anymore. And exercise, on the flip side, is good for microglial health. So it will reduce brain inflammation. And so that's one reason why exercise is good. There are a number of different forms, and they're likely doing different things. Aerobic exercise tends to be good because it can keep our weight down, going back to more, the diabetes conversation. But strength training is also great. Increased muscle mass is great because muscles actually make substances called myokines, which actually get to the brain and increase brain health. So again, it's probably more than one mechanism, but it's good. It's good. It's a take-home message.
So my main form of exercise is I get in the pool, and I can tell, there are days when I'm, I got some issue that I'm working on. I don't know quite how to write something or what to do. And I'll get in the pool, and then halfway while I'm exercising, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I'll go, oh, there it is. What, do you know what that is? Is there?
I mean, I don't know, but I want to. No, that could be endorphins.
Right.
That could be endorphins, right? So that's a different mechanism, but will stimulate your brain. And you talk about runners talk about the runner's high, for example. So that's endorphins, clearly. Yeah, and that's a real thing.
I'll take them. Okay, we have gotten a number of questions. Do over-the-counter brain support supplements work? What can you say about supplements?
Yeah, so supplements is getting into pretty dicey territory, in my view. Unclear for most of them. For the vast majority of supplements, it's unclear. For individuals who are in a situation where they're low on a particular nutrient, then that can get you back to baseline. And I think in some cases that's where they're helpful. There are some cases where the data are a little stronger. So for example, creatine, I think, is a good one. That's a natural substance that we make, and supplementing can be a good thing for memory. But again, you have to be careful with it and always talk to your doctor, because it can also be hard on your kidneys if you take too much of it. So to be determined for most brain supplements, I would proceed with caution in most cases and always talk to your doctor, because you don't want to overdo it and get too much load into your kidneys. It's a bad thing.
We have gotten a couple of questions about crosswords or word games, brain training. Is that good for us?
Yes.
What can you say about that?
Puzzles. So there are all different types of puzzles. Some I think sound like they're kind of expensive, to be honest. And that's a consideration, how much you want to pay. But okay, so here's what we know. So the good thing is that we know that education correlates with delayed risk of Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. We know that generally keeping your brain active with age is also associated with better brain health. So those are for sure. So then the question is, how do we maintain those things? And there's been a lot of talk over the years about whether or not these puzzles actually generalize more broadly, right? So if you just spend all day doing Sudoku, is that a good thing? Probably not. But is doing some Sudoku a good thing? Probably, right? And so, and they're only going to generalize so far, right? So if you're doing Sudoku, that might not help you find your car, that might not help you play your violin better. But if you're doing all of those things and picking up a number of different types of puzzles, and also including social interactions, which are good for the brain, exercise, then I think you're talking about really doing something significant. So I would not discourage anybody from doing crossword puzzles, absolutely not. I think that's probably a good thing.
Great. We got a question from somebody online. What is the relationship between cholesterol and dementia? Is it just another impact on the vascular system, or does it have some other mechanism there?
So that's a great question. And so this is not my area, but I will touch on it because I think it's again an emerging area that's very important because it has to do with ApoE. And so people have probably heard of ApoE, which is it's a gene, and there are different variants that are in the population. And certain variants of ApoE, well, there's a variant which is ApoE4, is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So individuals with 2 copies of ApoE4 have a much higher, I think it's about 10-fold risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And then there's another variant that's actually protective. So good news is ApoE2 is a different type of ApoE that's actually protective in the disease. And so ApoE is actually important for the cholesterol pathway and cholesterol function. So the answer is, the general answer is yes. It seems to be impacting development of Alzheimer's disease, and it has to do with this ApoE risk factor.
So if you have a higher cholesterol level, that may not be a good thing, right?
That would not be a good thing. Yeah.
Okay, got it. This is an interesting one because everybody knows that, at least I think we've been told that learning new things is good for the brain as we age, right? So I'm trying to learn a new instrument, but finding it difficult to remember or retain it in my brain. What techniques or strategies can I use to improve my memory for this? Do you have any help for this person? Who's doing the right thing, by the way.
I am not a musician. I would love to, I really envy this individual because this is on my list though, is to learn to play the piano, and my son picked up the piano just like that, right? And when I go over to the piano and try to do that, it's so much harder. So I feel like I would talk to a music teacher. I mean, it's practice, right? I mean, it's repetition. It is the number one thing, and probably practicing it in all different states. Don't maybe practicing at different times of day would be a good thing, but practice makes perfect.
You talked about this briefly. There's a question here about somebody who's had some pretty nasty concussions, and one of the, one of the risk factors for dementia is physical trauma.
Yeah.
So, what's impacted there? And if somebody has had concussions, is there anything out there that you're aware of that they should do?
Yeah. So this is most likely, again, going back to this idea of neuroinflammation, and individuals. I mean, it's just so sad that we're seeing this over and over again with individuals who started contact sports at a young age, and we're just now sort of making the connection. So my sense is that if you have a background of concussions, definitely talk to a neurologist about that, because maybe there are additional things that you could do, but definitely do all of the normal healthy brain aging things that I've mentioned. Yeah. So I would say do all of those things, and then I would talk to a neurologist about are there additional things to do there? Yeah, because we know there's a connection. Yeah, unfortunately.
So we're almost at an end here. Is there anything that we haven't, if you were going to give advice to these people, like what are some of the, if we were at a picnic together or around the dinner table and somebody said, Ashley, what should I do? What do you tell people?
Yeah. come to the Buck, learn about aging, learn everything you can about aging. It keeps your brain active, and it gives you tips, not just what we've talked about today, but it'll expand your world in so many different ways. Exercise, sleep, diet, I think are key. Social interaction, keep your brain active. Those are my top 5 for sure.
Great. And then in the overall field that's going on, is there anything that you find particularly exciting? Like what gets you like, oh boy, this is going to be really cool? Is there anything?
Yeah, I mean, so right now, as I mentioned, we're really digging into what's going on in the female brain. And we're not just looking at females. To better understand it, we're also looking at males. And both are equally important to us, but it's just the females are a little behind in terms of our understanding. And what we're looking at there is actually the impact of the X chromosome on potentially developing Alzheimer's disease and maintaining healthy cognitive function with age. Because what we had found in a recent study is that there are many more changes going on in the X chromosome in females with age than males with age, right? We have females, we have 2 X chromosomes, males have 1. There's something going on in the X chromosome, and it turns out there's actually an enrichment or an overabundance, let's say, of genes involved in brain function on the X chromosome compared to other chromosomes. And so, although I think things like hormones are really important in terms of sex differences with age, I think we're missing a piece of the puzzle, which has to do with what's going on inside the cell with age and how that causes differences between how the female brain ages and how the male brain ages. So that's an area that I think is really important that we're really digging into in the coming years.
That's great. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So here's what's going to happen next. You will get an email either later today or tomorrow with a link to today's event, so you can watch it over again if you need to. It will also include some links to some information that we hope will be helpful to you. And also, this is important for those of you who came here as a guest today. If you want to get that email, we need your email address. So if you want that on the way out, give us your email address. We'll have somebody at the registration table who can get that. So I will be back here on December 11th. We're going to stick with the brain. I'm going to be talking with Dr. Tara Tracy, who is she's taken an end run around Alzheimer's, and she's focusing on a particular form of brain resilience. So I encourage you to come to that. We are thrilled with the community's response to our clinical trials that are now underway in humans. There is a QR code there. There's a QR code out in the lobby. Use it. It will get you to the place on our website where you can get all the information. And there's a form where you can show your interest in taking part in our clinical trials. Next up, I would be remiss if I didn't make a pitch for fundraising. Your donations here at the Buck make a really big difference. Some of those clinical trials got kickstarted from the generosity of donors. So please, if you enjoyed today's event and you want to support our work, please give us some money. That would be great. Okay, so we mentioned intellectual stimulation is a good thing for aging. I want to give a really shout out. We have a great online learning class that you can learn all about the biology of aging. Seriously, it's getting really, really great reviews. And then we also have a podcast that's called We're Not Getting Any Younger Yet. And it involves interviews with researchers from aging from around the world, actually, like really leading experts in the field who talk about their work and give us some good tips. And for those of you who are new to the Buck, or even if it's been for a while since you've been here, come on a tour. We have them on Tuesdays and Thursdays mornings. We have a new museum exhibit as part of our tour, so you can learn about the history of the Buck, about our architecture, and about our science. So, also, you can keep up with the Buck. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can follow us on social media. No excuse not to know what's going on. So, once again, thanks for coming today. We did a test of a new hearing assistance program. If you were one of the folks who helped out with that, please remember to turn your gizmos back in before you leave the building. And that's it from me. Everybody, take care of yourself. Have a great Thanksgiving. I'll be back on December 11th.